All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's Dr. Kaz here, and I am doing a video here for slide identification for the axial skeleton. And we're going to talk a little bit about that so when we get into class, we can move into some more of the lecture-like material for lab here. But we're going to start off with the first part here. We're going to discuss a little bit about the skeleton, but we're going to start off with the axial skeleton. Back in chapter 1, we talked about the different components to anatomy and the study areas of anatomy. And one such region of anatomy was, well, I shouldn't say region, but part of anatomy was regional anatomy. So that's when we talk about certain areas of the body. And so when we talk about the skeleton, we break our skeleton down into two regions. The first of the two regions, which we're going to study here, is the axial skeleton. The second region is the appendicular skeleton. So we're going to talk about the axial skeleton. We'll do some labeling exercises with that. Okay, so when you think of the axial skeleton, all right, you want to think of all the bones that are along our body's central axis there, right? And that's pretty much your skull, your spine, and then the sacrum, which is at the bottom of the vertebral column. And we also include in that your thoracic rib cage. Okay, so the ribs will be included in that. All right, so again, the main function of the axial skeleton, all right, is going to be for support. Okay, especially when we're talking about the upright posture and the other part of your skeleton, the appendicular skeleton, attaches onto the axial skeleton, so that will support that also. But really, we see that it protects organs. Okay, and as you know, if you think about organ protection, you think of your ribs. Your rib cage protects the heart, protects the lungs, and the other structures in there. But not only that, the axial skeleton, the skull, protects the brain, which is an organ, and it also protects your spinal cord when we're talking about the vertebral column. That protects the spinal cord there. All right. And then, as we know, one of the functions of bone, all right, is the process of hemopoiesis, which is the formation of the formed blood elements. That includes the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and then our platelets. So here's a picture of the axial skeleton. So what's highlighted in that greenish blue there, that is what we are discussing when we discuss the axial skeleton. So we're going to see a couple different views here when we're starting with the skull. And I wanted to show them here for you. And I'm going to depict a couple here. All right, so this first one here that I'm pointing at, this is an inferior view of the skull. So we're looking up through the bottom of the skull. This right here is a frontal or anterior view. This one here is a lateral view. Okay. Over here, we have a posterior view looking at the back of somebody's head. Here's a superior view. We're looking down onto somebody. And then finally, we have our mid-sagittal view here. All right, sagittal view, this is when we've cut whatever we're looking at open and we're looking at it at the inside. All right. We'll go into a little more detail here, but when we're seeing this slide here, all right, that top view, all right, the part of the skull that we took off, all right, that's called the calvarium. We removed the calvarium, and now we're able to look in the interior portion of your skull here. All right, and what we're looking at is the cranium. The base of our cranium here is kind of like what your brain settles on there. All right, let's get into some slide identification here. This first slide that we're looking at is one of the bones that makes up the skull, and we'll discuss those here. So the bone that makes up the majority of your forehead and the superior portion of your orbits, which are your eye sockets, that's the frontal bone. And I caution you when you're taking the test that if it just has an arrow pointing to something, okay, and there's no words, you need to be very specific. If you see some words written on there, one of the things that we could ask you is name the bone. Okay, so I don't want you to be misled by that, because this arrow is pointing to the frontal bone, yes, but it's also pointing to this structure here, which is called the frontal squama. Okay, it's the flat portion of the frontal bone or your forehead here. Okay, So just don't write in frontal squama when the question on the slide asks you, what bone is this? Okay. Here's another bone model here, full skull. Okay, so it's pointing to the frontal squama there, or squama, however you'd like to pronounce that. Okay, staying on the frontal bone here, all right, we're going to move out to where your eyebrows kind of rest. And these arrows are pointing to those dashed lines there. And those dashed lines are representing what we call the supraorbital margin. Okay, so these are like these ridge lines that sit above your orbits or your eye sockets there. So that's supraorbital margin. All right, we'll show it to you on the full skull model here. And that's what we're looking at here, okay, here. All right, so now when we're looking at some of these slides here, right, you notice that we have some nicks and sometimes some holes in our bones here. So what we're looking at here, this little nick, all right, on the superior portion of the orbit there, all right, we call that a supraorbital notch. Supraorbital notch. All right, and we have one over here. It's just not as good, but that's another supraorbital notch. So I'll show you on this slide here. All right, here's a supraorbital notch. Here's another supraorbital notch. Okay, it's an incomplete circle. It's like a nick. Okay, if you notice over here though, this is a hole, a complete hole in the bone. We give that a different name. We're going to call that a supraorbital foramen. A foramen is a rounded hole. All right, so this is a supraorbital foramen. Okay, and it's right above the orbits there. All right, let's move on to a different bone in the skull here, and this is the bone that sits on the side of your head. Okay, and this is known as the parietal bone. Now it's really hard to figure out where this is on the skull because we don't really have a point of reference. So I'm going to give that to you here on this slide. All right, this next slide here, you can see that this green bone here, that's the parietal bone. Okay, so the parietal bone makes up the posterior superior portion of your skull. And there's two parietal bones. You have a left and a right one, and they both sit behind the frontal bone. Here's your frontal bone right here. Okay, and the parietal bone, this would be the right parietal bone, and you have one on the other side. So now we're going to use a normal colored skull here, and you can see back here is the parietal bone. All right, we're going to now move to another bone, another cranial bone that sits on the back of your head, and that's called the occipital bone. And on this model, it's colored blue. So you can see quite a bit of it is on the back, the posterior portion, but also on the inferior portion. It dips down in here. Okay, the occipital bone makes up a considerable portion of the base of the cranium there, or the floor of the cranium. So now let me show you on a different model, on a normal colored skull. Okay, we're looking at the posterior view of the skull, and this is the occipital bone, sitting right here on the back. And then we'll show it on a normal colored skull here on the lateral view. Okay, it's back here. All right, so that'll be the occipital bone. So now we're going to talk about a few structures here on the occipital bone. Okay, so I'm going to show you the occipital bone just by itself here from the interior view. All right, there's the foramen magnum, which is, again, foramen is a hole, a rounded hole, okay? And this is magnum, we call this the foramen magnum because this is the largest foramen in your skull, the largest opening here, okay? So that's the foramen magnum. On each side of the foramen magnum, here and here, okay, we have what are called the occipital condyles. Occipital condyle is a projection off of a bone. That's what a condyle is. It's a bony projection, but it's smooth and rounded. because it's going to form an articulation, and an articulation is a joint. So these bones here, these parts of the occipital bone, are going to form a joint with another bone. All right. I'll show you here. There are the occipital condyles on the complete inferior view of our skull. So here's the foramen magnum, and then just lateral to each side of the foramen magnum, there's one occipital condyle. Here's the other occipital condyle. Now, if you reach around and touch the back of your head on the occipital bone there, you may notice a bump on the back of the head. Okay, and that's called the external occipital protuberance. Okay, that's that bump that sits on the back of your head. It's a site for ligamentous and muscular attachment. All right. I was told that the larger that bump is, the smarter you are. But I've come to find out that that's not true. I was told that when I was a young kid. But we find out things as we grow up. Okay? All right. Let's move on to another cranial bone, and that's going to be the temporal bone. All right? The temporal bone is a bone that sits on the side of the head, just inferior to the parietal bone. Okay, and just anterior to the occipital bone. So basically, where the bone that your ear sits on, all right, and kind of covers up, that's the temporal bone. All right, let's look at it at a normal colored model here. Okay, tough to see. Okay, that's why it's always easier to use the colored models. All right, this right here is going to be, all right, our temporal bone, part of that. All kind of within here. It's not the best drawing, okay? But there's your temporal bone. Let me show you the bone all by itself. There you go. That is the temporal bone all by itself. And the arrow's actually pointing to the squamous portion. Squamous means flat. That's the smooth, flattened portion here of the temporal bone. That's the squamous part. And this is the external view. This is what we would see from the outside. So now what I'm going to show you is we're going to take the bone, we're going to flip it over and look at it from the inside. And where those arrows are pointing to, okay, that ridge-like structure, that's called the Petrous part. You could also call it the Petrous portion, right? But that's the Petrous part of the temporal bone. Essentially, your ear canal runs inside of that structure. So let me show you now in the whole skull. We remove the top of the skull, okay? And now I am showing you the Petrous part or Petrous portion of the temporal bone. There you go. Okay, Petrous part, Petrous portion of the temporal bone. That's from the internal portion of the skull. So let's go back to the outside and take a look. All right, some of the structures that we need to know. This first one that's listed here is known as the external auditory meatus. Okay, that's the opening to your ear canal. Okay, so your ear surrounds, or the external portion of your ear, the pinna, okay, or the auricle, spelled with a A-U-R. All right, the auricle there, that is going to surround that hole. Okay, so we call that the external auditory meatus. Now, just behind the external auditory meatus, all right, is this bump, and you can feel it if you go to your ear and you feel this, the bone right behind your ear. You kind of just follow it around there. That's called the mastoid process. Okay, it's a site for muscular attachment, but inside the mastoid process, you have, all right, these what we call air cells. Okay, it's not uncommon for those air cells, okay, to get an infection called mastoiditis. So if you get significant pain, but it's not in your ear, but it's behind your ear, there is a possibility that you could have mastoiditis. All right, So now what we're going to do is we're going to actually draw forward here a little bit, and we see this little pointy projection coming off of the bone here, right, inferior to the acoustic meatus there, and that's called the styloid process. Again, a process is a projection off of the bone. All right, so this looks like a stylus. If you ever have a stylus for any tablets or whatnot, so we call this the styloid process. Then we go anterior to the auditory canal there, and we see this little indentation or depression right in here. Okay, and that's referred to as the mandibular fossa. Now that's where your mandible will articulate with your skull, and that forms what's commonly known as the TMJ, or the temporomandibular joint. Okay, the name of this joint tells you what bones articulate with one another to form the joint. So temporo coming from, all right, the temporal bone, mandibular, obviously the mandible, your jaw. Okay, so that is the temporomandibular joint, but that is what we're depicting here with this dashed line, and what the arrow is pointing to is the mandibular fossa. All right, now we can actually see the mandibular fossa with the mandible articulating with it. Okay, and that's on our lateral view. And I'll show it to you on this other model here. There you go. Okay, so I don't know if you've noticed this, but there is another bony projection coming off of the temporal bone. Okay, and that's this whole structure right here. All right, so that's another process. And we name this process after the bone to which it articulates with. So if you look at the title here, zygomatic process, then the bone that it's touching or articulating with is known as the zygomatic bone. Okay? So we refer to this as the zygomatic process. All right, and here you can see the zygomatic process. All right, so up front here, this is the zygomatic bone. Okay? And so there's this structure that you're going to see through here, all right? And we give that a name, okay? When you see on the test this oval circle around that portion of the skull, okay? We call that the zygomatic arch. The zygomatic arch is made up of two bones, okay? The temporal bone and the zygomatic bone. So that means that the zygomatic bone has its own process that it sends off to articulate with the temporal bone. But we do the same thing when we name that process. We will name it after the name of the bone that it articulates with. All right, and we'll talk about that later on. But for right now, okay, where these two bones join one another, okay, and it includes this oval is going around both bones, not the entirety of both bones, but those portions of those bones, and that's referred to as the zygomatic arch. It makes up part of your cheek on the side of your face there. All right, let's flip the skull. All right, and we'll look at the bottom portion of the skull, because there's a couple other structures that I want to cover here. Okay, so we already talked about this hole. And then we have these two processes here and here, right? We call those the occipital condyles. Now, if we go just lateral to both of those occipital condyles, we run into these holes here, one here and one over here. And so we call those the jugular foramen. Okay? And the jugular foramen is going to be where the internal jugular vein, all right, is going to emerge from. Okay, because remember, veins carry blood towards the heart. Arteries bring blood away from the heart. Okay, so the internal jugular vein, right, will emerge from here, all right, and bring blood to the heart. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to move just anterior up to this hole here and this hole here. Okay, we're going to move just over there. Those are called the carotid canals. Okay, the carotid canals are going to be where we see the internal carotid artery enter into the skull. So you have an internal and you have an external carotid artery. Okay, the internal carotid artery is going to enter into the skull. Both internal carotid arteries supply your brain with 80% of its blood flow. Okay, so the right internal carotid artery supplies 40%. The left internal carotid artery supplies the other 40%, together 80. All right. Here is that zygomatic process one more time, coming off the temporal bone there. Okay? And we can see it one more time here. And then finally, then we have the zygomatic process articulating with the zygomatic bone. All right, that whole region there on the side of your face, just in front of your ear, that's known as the zygomatic arch. All right, so another bone that I want to talk about in your skull, okay, is this bone here called the sphenoid bone. Let me show you the sphenoid bone all by itself. To me, it kind of reminds me of a butterfly. All right. But when we see it inside the skull here, I'll do my best to try to draw it for you. This is not the best outline, but it's kind of like within that region. Well, this line should come out a little bit more. It should be more like that. All right. That's the sphenoid bone. Okay. Up here, where I'm drawing this oval, that's the frontal bone up there. Okay. Back through here, all right, a significant portion, that's going to be, all right, our occipital bone, temporal bone over here, temporal bone over here. Okay. So you can kind of get a little bit of a relation here of where the sphenoid bone is. All right. So here's the sphenoid bone all by itself again. All right, so there's a couple parts of the sphenoid bone that we're going to label here. All right, this flat portion here, that's going to be the greater wing of the sphenoid, here and here. All right, the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. So that's why I kind of think it looks like a butterfly. Here you can see it on this model here. Okay. And then we'll point it out to you and for you on the actual skull so you can get a little bit of an appreciation. So here you can see it. That arrow is pointing to the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. So if we have a greater wing, right, then we're going to have a lesser wing. And so the lesser wings sit above the greater wings of the sphenoid. So you can see right up here. Okay. The lesser wings are going to be these portions here. Okay, with your greater wings down below, here and over here. So you can see them here on this model, right? A little bit easier to see. And then you can see them here, and I'll try to outline them for you here. And here. All right, so those are your lesser wings. All righty. Another structure to point out are the optic canals. Okay, so the nerves okay, that carry visual information from your eyes to your brain. Okay, they leave the eyeball and they'll travel through, all right, these little tunnel structures here, and these are called the optic canals, named after the nerve that travels inside of them. Those are called the optic nerve. That is cranial nerve number 2. All right, I know you don't have this in the atlas, but I know you have this one in the atlas. It's kind of tough to see at this angle, but that's where the optic canals are located, those openings there, right near the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. All right, so we're going to go back to the sphenoid bone and we're going to look at it, okay? We're going to flip it around and we're going to look at it from a different angle here, okay? So here you can see this kind of, what's the term that I want to use for this? The name of it is actually the superior orbital fissure, but it's almost like a crack, right, an oblong opening here, okay? And so this is located in the posterior region of your orbit, okay? And that structure is called the superior orbital fissure. Right? In between the two fissures, the left and right superior orbital fissures, you have the actual body of the sphenoid bone. Now, the sphenoid bone has a very important job, as do all bones, okay? But it forms a structure around a very, very important gland. The gland is called the pituitary gland. It plays a humongous role, all right, in hormone regulation, okay? And so this next view that I'm going to show you is a sagittal view. So we've cut the skull down the middle, and you can see that that arrow is pointing at this structure, okay, in the sphenoid bone. All of this is the sphenoid bone here, here. Not all this down here, but here, okay. So it forms, all right, in the sphenoid bone, you have this little saddle-like structure, or like a cup. And inside of this hole, all right, is where the pituitary gland sits. Okay, so if we take a closer look, all right, we have this structure here, this kind of cup. And we call that the Sella Turcica, which actually stands for Turkish saddle. All right, but the pituitary gland sits right in here. It's got this little stalk-like structure. We call that the infundibulum. And then so we can keep it nice and cozy, we put this connective tissue layer right over it. And we call that the diaphragma cellae. So it keeps the pituitary gland safe. But there's a hole in the middle of it, and that allows for the infundibulum to leave. We'll learn all that stuff later on. Okay? So here you can see the Sella Turcica here on this model. Okay? And this is the Turkish saddle right in here. I'll show you on this model here that's in your atlas. So that kind of depression there, outlined or highlighted by that dashed black line that the arrow is pointing to, that is the Sella Turcica. And one more picture of it, so you never forget it. Okay, we've already seen that one, but this one. Okay, so several different views of the Sella Turcica. I want you to be familiar with all those because those may show up again. Okay, one last part of the sphenoid bone, and we saw it on this view before. Okay, we had these parts of the bone hanging down here and over here. Those are called the pterygoid processes. If we're talking about one, then it's a pterygoid process. Okay, and the pterygoid process, all right, has, all right, these two little nubbins that kind of hang off. Okay, one on each process. or 2 on each process, I should say, excuse me. The one that's further out to the side, that's called the lateral pterygoid plate, and that's where some muscles of mastication attach onto. A muscle of mastication is a muscle that helps you to chew, helps to move your mandible. And then here on the inside is the medial pterygoid plate. You can see it here. Here's the lateral pterygoid plate. Here's the medial pterygoid plate. Okay. Together, that's what this circle is showing you. That's known as the pterygoid process. So if you look at this here, this is the lateral pterygoid plate. This is the medial pterygoid plate. All right. One of the other bones that we're going to talk about today is the ethmoid bone. Okay. This bone plays a big role, all right, in the nasal cavity. Okay. So it helps to make up the superior portion of your nasal cavity. This is a lateral view of the bone. Okay. And it sits, all right, within the frontal bone. So it's tough to see, but I'm going to put a circle around the ethmoid bone. Okay. So much like an island sits in the ocean, okay, the island surrounded by water. In this case, our ethmoid bone is our island, and it's surrounded by the frontal bone. So everything outside that blue circle that you see is going to be the frontal bone. All right, so that is the ethmoid bone sitting there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to cut away, same view, okay? We're going to zoom in on the ethmoid bone, and we're going to cut away all of the frontal bone so you can actually see, all right, the ethmoid bone without the frontal bone covering it up. And that's what we see here. This is the ethmoid bone. Okay, this is a superior view. We're looking down on the ethmoid bone. We've just zoomed in on that previous slide, and we just cut away the frontal bone. And this part of the ethmoid bone that the arrow is pointing to is what we call the cribriform plate. The cribriform plate has all these holes in it. Okay, it's almost like a sponge. You look at how a sponge has all the holes in it. Similar here. Okay, and this cribriform plate, all those holes are for nerves, all right, that are going from the brain down into the superior portion of your nasal cavity for the special sense of olfaction, and that is smell. Okay, so some of the nerves, all right, that help you with your sense of smell, all right, are going to come off of the brain and head down through these holes and into the superior, the upper portion of your nasal cavity. And they travel through the cribriform plate. All right, now this view is an anterior view of your skull. We're looking at your face. All right, and what that arrow is pointing to is one of the 2 bones that make up your nasal septum. And if you're not familiar with what that is, and I'm sure that some of you probably heard the term deviated septum, okay, before. Well, the nasal septum divides your nasal cavity into the left and right chambers, okay? So the upper portion of the nasal septum, right, is formed from, all right, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. So pretty much above this blue line that I'm putting in. All right, all above that, okay, right here where this other blue line is coming in, all of that is going to be the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. All right, so now we'll just show you what that looks like when the ethmoid bone is all by itself. We've cut everything else away. It looks kind of scary, I know, but don't judge this bone. It wasn't born pretty. Okay, so this big long process that you see hanging down off of this bone here, all right, that is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. So way at the top of the bone, you got this little guy hanging out. To me, it looks like a shark fin. Okay, So we're going to go back to that lateral view of the ethmoid bone that we saw when we first looked at the bone. Okay, and that little shark fin-like structure that's hanging off the top, it's this thing right here. That's the Crista Galli. All right, that's a site for a type of connective tissue that we'll talk about in chapter 13, I want to say, for lab. All right, we'll see a connective tissue attachment onto that part of this bone here. So more on that later on. Okay. All right. Now we're going to look. See, this is a lateral view, so we're looking at this bone from the side. So now what we're going to do in the next slide is we're going to look at the ethmoid bone from the inferior view. So we're going to start this next view. We're going to look up into the ethmoid bone. Okay, so just to kind of give you some perspective. All right, if I was looking at the side of your head and I cut all the other cranial bones away and left the ethmoid bone, this is what I would see. Now I'm going to look up. All right, from the inferior view. And that's the ethmoid bone from the inferior view if I was looking up. Okay? All right. Going back to that cribiform plate like I was telling you before, all right, this is a superior view. We're looking down here, all right, at the ethmoid bone. And you can see all these little nooks and crannies. It's like a Thomas English muffin. You have all these little holes here. Okay? And there's two names that we give those holes. Okay? More commonly known as the olfactory foramina. Again, that's where the olfactory nerves will enter into from the brain down into the nasal cavity. Also known as the cribiform foramina. Either or is acceptable. Either or is fine. All right, and then finally, on this last slide here that I want to show you, again, another sagittal view. And you can see in this middle picture, that is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. There's another bone down here. We'll talk about that in a later lesson. That's called the vomer. Because if you remember, your nasal septum, okay, is made up of two bones. We just talked about the ethmoid bone. That's the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. All right, down below it is the vomer. You can see them both together here. Now you notice there's stuff missing from here. All right, that's cartilage. Okay, so part of your nasal septum is made up of cartilage. But if you notice, I call it when I say the bony nasal septum, I'm referring to these two bones here. I'm not even talking about cartilage when I refer to the bony nasal septum. Okay, well, that concludes the identification portion for the first part of chapter 8. All right, I wanted to catch you up on that because we're going to go into some lecture material on this chapter, and then we'll do some more labeling here. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. More to come on the axial skeleton. Okay, continue all the hard work. I know you folks are doing great. And of course, like always, email me or ask me questions in class. I'll be more than happy to answer all of them gleefully. Okay, that concludes this lesson. Y'all have a good one.